With regard to Russia, I don't think Russia is a serious threat to the United States. And indeed, I think the United States should have good relations with Putin. I think the idea that a united Europe is going to come to the rescue of the Ukrainians is not going to happen. As I said, if you look at the present peace plan that the Europeans are floating, it's basically a French-British plan. And there's no evidence that the Italians and the Germans are enthusiastic about it.
Trump doesn't want to hold a losing hand, and the Europeans, who are very warmongering these days, cannot substitute for U.S. finance and U.S. armament. So the war is going to end soon.
I think what's going on here is that you have to understand that the British, the French, and the Ukrainians are working together to try to trap the Americans into giving a security guarantee to Ukraine. Trump does not, under any circumstances, want to give Ukraine a security guarantee. And here we're talking about in terms of his negotiations with Putin. The British, the French, and the Ukrainians are trying to get that security guarantee. And you want to remember that on Monday of last week, Macron visited. On Thursday of last week, Starmer visited. And then on Friday, Zelensky came in. And all of the discussion these days is revolving around this mineral deal. And the mineral deal is designed to trap the United States into giving a security commitment in a very sort of indirect way to the Ukrainians. Article 4 of the agreement says there will be common protection of critical resources. This is the way they're trying to trap Trump and company. And Trump won't be trapped. And the truth is, Trump and Vance are sick and tired of playing these games with the Ukrainians, with the British, and with the French, and they won't give them what they want. I think it's not retrievable. I think Trump has made it clear that he's going to cut a deal with the Russians. And I think he's made it clear that he's not going to give a security guarantee to Ukraine. And that's not going to change regardless of what happened on Friday.
Trump is, to his wisdom on this, trying to end it. He doesn't want to hold a losing hand. He knows that this war is lost on the battlefield, destroying Ukraine, and completely unnecessary.
And if you think about the position that Zelensky is in, he's in desperate straits. He's led his country into a war that has resulted in a catastrophe. And he's trying to figure a way out. And he thinks that security guarantee from the United States is absolutely essential, and he can't get it. So the level of frustration here is just enormous.
I do see an end to the conflict because the conflict depends on financing and arming of Ukraine by the United States. In other words, this is a proxy war of the United States fighting Russia. It's doing it by hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians being killed. It's a terrible war. Trump doesn't want to hold a losing hand, and the Europeans, who are very warmongering these days, cannot substitute for U.S. finance and U.S. armament. So the war is going to end soon. I think Trump is actually saving Ukraine, not harming Ukraine, because continuation of the war is not saving Ukraine. That's the basic reality. If Ukraine were going to win the war, and no way that can happen, then it would be a different matter. I don't believe in any way this narrative or rhetoric that Trump is against Ukraine. I think he's actually saving Ukraine.
My sense is the Americans have effectively committed themselves to trying to cut a deal with the Russians. They know what the Russians' terms are for cutting a deal. They're very clear. Putin laid them out on June 14th of 2024. And one would think the Americans clearly understand what they are and have reached the conclusion that they have to accept Russian terms by and large. So I think that the Russians and the Americans will be able to reach an agreement. What the Russians want, and I believe what Trump wants, is a genuine peace agreement where they not only shut down the Ukraine war, they get some meaningful security architecture in place in Europe so we don't have any more trouble in the foreseeable future. That's what Putin and Trump want.
What I think should be done is a permanent peace, not a ceasefire or an armistice line. I don't want to revisit this war and have irredentist sentiments and lobbying for a renewed war and new military buildups and all the rest. I want peace. There should be peace.
Well, there was an agreement on the table, April 15, 2022, which people can find online, which was essentially a way to end the war. And it was with security arrangements for Ukraine. It was with some territorial concessions or adjustments. For example, Crimea's no way going back to Ukraine because of Russian security needs. And at this point, after several years of war, parts of eastern and southern Ukraine are not going back. But the framework of the agreement was already there, April 15, 2022. The United States and UK told the Ukrainians on that date, don't sign, fight on. They thought Russia would back down. They thought Russia would lose. They thought that American sanctions would kill the Russian economy. All very, very bad miscalculations by the Biden administration.
I made the argument for a long time that NATO expansion into Ukraine was a prescription for disaster, because I understood full well that the Russians viewed Ukraine becoming part of NATO as an existential threat. We continued to pursue NATO expansion, and the end result is that in February of 2022, the war broke out. We would have avoided that war.
Why I don't like Ukraine is that I don't see any reason in the world that NATO has to be on Russia's border with Ukraine. I was, as I said, Gorbachev's advisor and Yeltsin's advisor, and they wanted peace and they wanted cooperation. But whatever they wanted, they did not want the U.S. military on their border.
From the U.S. point of view, it was kind of a game. The game was expand NATO to surround Russia. Well, anyone sensible, and there were many sensible American diplomats, knew that this was a provocative and dangerous approach because it was based on the whole idea that the United States would push NATO to Ukraine and to Georgia, surround Russia in the Black Sea, and that Russia couldn't do anything about it. But Russia said, no, we're not accepting that.
In Ukraine, we know in late January 2014, you have Victoria Nuland on the phone with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat, who is still a senior State Department official.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay.
They discuss who they're going to put in for the new government. And on February 22nd, a few weeks later, it's Yatsenyuk. He becomes the new prime minister. And by the way, that's the start of the Ukraine war.
Zelensky has no real future. He took Ukraine to war. He went along with the Biden administration and with the European elites. And what he produced for his country is a catastrophe. This war is a catastrophe. So the only interesting question is when he goes. I mean, his legacy has been firmly established now. It was a failure, and history will judge him accordingly.
So yes, of course there can be security guarantees, but Zelensky has to negotiate. Mr. Zelensky, you are ruling by martial law. Your own people want peace right now. They want peace even with territorial adjustments. That's what the opinion surveys show.
And furthermore, if you look at the plan, the so-called peace plan that the British and the French came up with and they unveiled yesterday, it's not a serious proposal. You sort of wonder what planet these people are living on. It has a 2-step set of propositions built into it. The first is that you're going to have a ceasefire for about a month. And then the British and the French and their coalition of the willing are going to put peacekeepers inside of Ukraine. The Russians have made it unequivocally clear there's going to be no ceasefire, number one. And number two, they've made it unequivocally clear they're not going to let British and French troops into Ukraine. They may come in, but the Russians will target them. Trump and Vance understand that this plan that Macron and Starmer have come up with is unworkable. I want to be clear here. I don't think there is all that much unity right now. I think the Italians have made it clear to the French that they cannot commit Italian forces to deploy in Ukraine. And the Italians and the Germans have shown hardly any enthusiasm for the British and French plan. This is really very much a British and French peace plan. I think the idea that a united Europe is going to come to the rescue of the Ukrainians now that the Americans are divorcing themselves from the Ukrainian situation is not going to happen. I think that the Europeans worked very well together with the United States in the context of NATO because the United States was the big dog. It was the most powerful state in Europe. Obviously, it's not a European country, but it was physically located in Europe with all those troops. And we basically ran the alliance. And we solved, in large part, not completely, but in large part, all the collective action problems that exist among the Europeans. You take the Americans away and the Europeans are left on their own, they're going to be huge collective action problems. And they're not going to be able to put together a United States of Europe or a unified army. So I don't see a European army that's going to be able to back up Ukraine. And furthermore, it's not just military wherewithal that you need here. You also need economic support. Huge amounts of money needs to be sent to Ukraine to keep this war going. And if you take the Americans away and the Europeans are on their own, they're effectively going to have to double the amount of money they give to Ukraine for a losing war. How long is that politically sustainable?
So the Europeans need to get their, they need to understand a little bit of history. Now, what should they do? They should open up their own security negotiations with Russia, stop the Russophobia, and negotiate directly with Russia. This is very clear.
I think the interesting question is whether the United States pulls so many troops out of Europe that its commitment to NATO, its commitment to Europe just disappears. I think that is possible. I think Trump is radical enough in his approach to Europe, and he has enough contempt for the Europeans that if things don't go his way and the Europeans resist him, he could just, in large part, walk away from Europe. And although NATO might remain formally intact, it'll be a hollow shell of its former self.
It will happen if there is no settlement of this war, if Europe says, but if Europe says we fight until 1991 borders are restored, the United States will wash its hands of all of this. They will not play a losing hand. The United States started it, but the U.S. drops countries like hot potatoes, whether it's Vietnam or Afghanistan, now Ukraine. So if the Europeans push so hard of Zelensky, because for whatever reason, as an individual, says what is not in the interest of his country, it could be pretty bad for the relations between Europe and the United States. I would not recommend that at all. But the confusion of NATO and Europe is deadly. Europe basically should have its own foreign policy and its own military security, its own strategic autonomy, so-called. And it should. I'm in favor of that. I would disband NATO, and maybe Trump is going to do it anyway. Maybe Trump's going to invade Greenland. Who knows? Then you're really going to find out what NATO means.